Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, Why Social Emotional Learning, SEL, is now priority number one. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the editor at large for eSchool News, and I'm excited to have you join us for what should be a very informative session. Today's event is brought to you by, since 2000, Stride Learning Solutions. Since 2000, Stride Learning Solutions has been a leader in strategic solutions to solve district challenges. Stride's flexible online and blended learning options boost modern instruction and promote lifelong student success. With an innovative platform, comprehensive digital courseware, adaptive technology, and extensive support, Stride is equipped to help your school or district empower a brighter future for learners. A news note here: on December 16th, 2020, K-12 Inc. became Stride. As a Stride company, they continue serving K-12 districts while expanding reach to offer learning solutions for students of all ages. And with me today is Erica Siebert. Erica currently serves as Stride's Director of School Counseling and Social Emotional Learning Programs. Prior to joining Stride, Erica held a variety of positions in education, including teacher, advisor, and counselor across grades K to 12. She is a certified counselor and utilizes her free time to volunteer for organizations with a mission to empower children and teens with special interests in grief loss counseling, post-secondary preparation, and serving at Promise Youth. Now, before we get into our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform that we're using here. Today's event will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A box. There will be time at the end of the presentation for our speaker to address questions. And I really encourage everyone to feel free to add those questions in as we're going along in the conversation. I really think it helps bring additional insights to what Eric and I will be discussing. There's also a chat function you can launch by clicking on the chat. Feel free to use this feature to contact someone from the eSchool News team if you have a technical question, but please don't use that for the Q&A. Also, there's a closed caption available by clicking on that. Now, and again, before we get into the conversation, we have a few questions that we'd like to ask the audience. Chris, if you could throw up poll question number one. So as an educator, have you participated in preparation programs that place a strong emphasis on social emotional learning? That's, at the current moment, is that something that you have in place? So give a couple seconds to answer that question, and the answers will pop up. I know that in my reporting over the years that before the pandemic, it was almost sometimes seen as a nice to have, and where now DP during the pandemic, it is obviously priority number one for everyone. So results here, Erica, 65% say yes, that they currently do have one, but 35% don't. So that's a pretty significant percentage. So I'm really glad that you folks joined us today and can take advantage of Erica's expertise. Chris, can you work poll number two up? So in your state, do you currently have a set standard, SEL standard that you operate within? Because I know another thing, because of this renewed recognition of the importance of social emotional learning, that at least because it's become front and center, you see various government entities taking a look at it where maybe they wouldn't have even recognized it before. Okay, so we're right there, 50-50, only half have state standards. So that could be something interesting we can dive into, Erica, on the differences between operating within a state standard or when you're kind of going it alone. And one more question for the audience. What do you think is the most important factor in raising student achievement? Is it the school climate? Is it the parent support and engagement, teaching quality, or student engagement and motivation? I could also add in a fifth one there is maybe all of the above, right? And we'll see what we get from those. Okay, so student engagement and motivation seems to be the top respondent. What where school climate, parent support, teaching quality, nobody. Interesting, but great. I think that helps us, Erica, kind of going into this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today on this important topic.
Thanks so much for having me. And I just want to reiterate, thank you to everyone who's joining, because just by being here today, it shows that you're making SEL a priority in your school community, which is really key to starting or continuing any program.
Yeah, and so, as I mentioned during the poll questions, Erica, over the years, I would go to ISTE or, go to TCEA, and there'd be a session about SEL, and I would forget what SEL meant. And then it would be, oh, social emotional learning. And I'm like, and people would nod and say, oh yeah, well, I know what that is, but nobody, it's one of those kind of expressions or acronyms you find in the education space. It always seem to be kind of cloudy, right? March 2020 hits, and now everyone knows what it means and everyone understands the importance of it, right?
Yeah. And let's just start there. What is SEL and social emotional learning? One thing I really appreciated out of the pandemic was the change in definition, just to reflect that it's really a lifelong process. It impacts both students, but also adults, all of us here in this room, every single educator that's leading a classroom or district administrator. So it's really that process over time where young people and also adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop things like healthy identities, managing their emotions, working with others, making responsible decisions. And these things, as you mentioned, with the situation we've all been in before at a conference with what is SEL? Oh, does that even apply to me as maybe a classroom teacher, as a district administrator? And resoundingly, if there's one thing you leave with today, I hope the answer is yes. It's applicable to all roles in a school. Because these aren't just soft skills, which is maybe how we've heard about them before. They're nice to haves. They're something a counselor will do. They're touchy-feely. They don't really impact academic achievement. And what the research shows is they do, and they're really essential skills. And I, arguably will say, I use these in everyday life, in the workplace, in my home life, in social situations, just out in the community. And so these are really things we're using throughout our life that we may or may not use, with every single standard that we learn in the classroom. So they're really key. They're really essential. And we can't have academic growth or achievement without really that focus on the whole child and social emotional well-being.
Go a little deeper into the idea and concepts behind SEL, what I call BP, before the pandemic and now. I mean, how has this experience specifically, I mean, the phrase I keep hearing, everything's been accelerated, right? I mean, I certainly think that these concepts of not only social emotional learning, but mental health in general has really become accelerated. How has your work and the work that Stride does accelerated over the past 18 months?
The biggest change I've seen is just the approach. So prior to the pandemic, usually in schools, there was a champion or two or more that really found the impact SEL had on their own lives. And this is, think of like a really passionate teacher or a counselor who is leading some form of SEL curriculum or strategies one-off in their own classroom environment, maybe. And what the pandemic really exacerbated for all of us was the need for social emotional learning for everyone, students and adults, in the building, so to speak, but in our virtual environment too. And so it really became mainstream for SEL to be a school-wide implementation and approach. And if there's one positive thing out of the pandemic for schools, this is one of them, because the emphasis was here and the momentum we've been able to garner to really show that from a community perspective, the leadership, the teachers, the parents, the students, the community, all of your stakeholders really speaking the same language and approaching learning, starting with the students' needs first is kind of the biggest shift I've seen, is that school-wide systemic implementation, looking at data, what that means for all students and not just the couple of students that might be receiving support services.
Yeah, wow, you have had so much in that answer. So I have a number of questions as a result. I guess the first is, let's talk about the technology a little bit. So again, before the pandemic, how much emphasis was there on remote applications of social emotional learning? You mentioned a couple of times, like in the building and on campus. All of a sudden, that the campus means Zoom, right? Or it means some sort of remote setup, whether it's Teams or Meet or however you're doing it. Talk a little bit about the transition of having an SEL curriculum where you're in person versus one to where you're doing what we're doing right now, which is Zooming.
Well, I think anything really from in the building to working remotely is really just a matter of translating those best practices that we know in whatever setting it is, if you think about your traditional brick and mortar school, and translating them to the modalities you have to deliver instruction online. So in terms of SEL, I think a lot of people felt the scramble to suddenly create or reinvent the resources in a different modality than maybe they were using previously. So the simplest example, take your worksheet and make it an e-form that students could contribute to directly remotely. For us, at Stride, we've been in the online space for decades now. So that kind of scramble that happened for most districts really wasn't one of our biggest challenges, because we already had infrastructure and systems and lessons and curriculum, et cetera, set up for the online environment. And so I think that's the biggest shift I saw from districts that were implementing online learning, is just using the resources that are already out there, great resources in the space of SEL, lessons, curriculum, et cetera, for students just while they schooled from home.
Mm. And the second part that you mentioned when you talked about the wider community, a big shift has been the involvement of parents, which may not have been there as, at least to the degree that it is now, right? So the remote thing sets up the emphasis. I mean, really, those first few weeks, I mean, people were employing social emotional learning whether they knew it or not, right? I mean, because
Right.
all it was is just like, let's get connected. How are you feeling? Are you sick? How is your home set up? And that wasn't even just the dynamic between teacher and student. It was between teacher and teacher and teacher and parent and administrator. It was everyone. Talk about, I mean, that's another silver lining. Maybe if we can kind of keep that dynamic going, right? Talk a little bit about bringing in, and you know what? And as a parent, I spent more time speaking with my kids' teachers than I had ever before. And it was through the remote setup that it happened, right? I mean, we had a back to school night that was Zoom, that was actually quite efficient. And some other, one-to-one meetings that either wouldn't have happened or they would have been awkward. So we can talk from your perspective about how the wider community involvement is important for proper SEL, and how do we keep that dynamic going?
Yeah, with any SEL program, I mean, in any school or education, whatever it is, parents are key, because they're with that child and they're reinforcing those principles and so many of those skills that we're teaching students through SEL. So they are one of those key audiences or stakeholders that we need to be educating along with ourselves and our students. So I agree that in 2020, I most feel for parents. I certainly feel for educators, but so many of our educators are also parents. And it was a really strained year to not only juggle work from home, but schooling from home and parenting amidst a lot of stress. And a lot of times to help folks understand SEL, I always return to the educator classic of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the middle layer there are those social connections, family and friendships. And if you think about what happened during the pandemic, that really swung in both directions, right? You may have gotten a whole lot more intimacy and closeness with your family unit and a whole lot less with your peer group or your friends. So that was the one level that was really, really stressed. And especially for students and families that experience loss as a result of the pandemic, that one really is out of whack with, those family relationships that you have in your home and how those are impacted. So I think that was probably one of the greatest impacts out of last year was this just that change in our social lives, where we kind of went up in one direction of the scale and then it tipped to the other one down. And still that's very much in flux and people are figuring out what that looks like. Regardless though, we mentioned earlier the school-wide implementation of SEL, and any school-wide program is going to think about that audience of the parents that are at home or the guardians, and they're going to be including them in the messaging, the decision making, the education, the training around SEL activities to do at home. That's something that we do regularly is share out, here's the theme we're studying right now for SEL. Here are some at-home activities, some simple conversation starters for the dinner table where you can discuss this with your child and learn more about what they're learning in the classroom.
Talk a little bit about how it's integrated into the everyday curriculum. So, I mean, is it an added on, or is it, you probably need it more than ever in social studies these days. But like in each specific subject, take us through a kind of like a day-to-day, if you're an administrator or you're one of those 35% who are listening right now who don't have something in place.
So ideally it's going to be integrated, but honestly, I kind of see it in three different phases, depending where your school is with starting your program. The first might be like a standalone lesson where we're teaching something very distinct related to one of the core competencies of SEL and those skills. And that's what the lesson is based on, is really rooted in SEL. The second piece is going to be integration into the regular classroom environment with the teacher themselves, where they are bringing in bits and pieces of SEL strategies or concepts into their regular classroom environment and lesson. And there are some simple best practices that maybe we can come back to that are just good to model in any classroom environment that aren't necessarily SEL content, but just some of the routines and rituals that make for great learning environments. And then the third way is really that next level, which is what you were alluding to, is that cross-curricular SEL infusion, where maybe you're reading a particular literature piece that has some of these concepts, such as empathy for characters, etc. And that's where you can really infuse those SEL concepts into the content itself. And so those are three different ways that I'll see SEL implemented, but ideally it's going to be integrated. It's not just going to be a standalone lesson where one teacher or counselor or person is teaching a group of kids and then they never hear about those concepts in the rest of their school day.
Yeah. Now, is this something that is a bottoms up implementation or a top down? Talk about how it could be scaled from a classroom to a school to a district, or is it that you start at the district and try to push it down?
I grapple with this myself, which is why I'm smiling in response, because I really see it both ways. It can be an organic grassroots, and I think there's a lot of authenticity there. However, if I had to choose one, I would say it has to start with our district leadership and our school leadership to say, this is a priority and here's some organization around what we're going to do. One thing I think is really beneficial and so simple is just having a common language around SEL, so that when a student is hearing an SEL concept from one teacher or leader, it's resonating with them and they're hearing that same language again. So think about growth mindset, for example. That's something we've all heard about. Teaching that growth mindset, that word yet, I haven't mastered this yet. Those are things we can all do and model. And it's going to reinforce for students without even explicitly teaching them, a slide with here's what growth mindset is. So I really think some organization at the district level or the school level around what that common language is going to be, so that then all the educators and teachers can be using that again with all the audiences, our students, our parents, and our staff.
Right, right. And as sick as I am of talking about it, and we've been talking about it already, but going into this current school year, COVID-19 is still with us. The pandemic is still something that we have to deal with. I've seen some results come in from surveys, when people talk about learning loss when it comes to literacy and math and in reading specifically. But other experts I've spoken to is like, you know what, that's not going to be the issue. I mean, the issue is going to be behavioral and getting students, not only right, but almost kind of a reconditioning. Does that change the way in which SEL would be delivered? I mean, we're actually having these new group traumas that haven't been around before, and they continue. So I just wonder, is that a pivot that is being made on the curriculum side of things?
Well, I think with the integrated approach, just like you would do your tier one kind of whole group supports for, let's say, your SEL curriculum, you're going to infuse your SEL strategies into tier two and tier three, so that those students that need that extra support are receiving those specific strategies and maybe even coping mechanisms, talking about what we're still in the thrust of. But one thing I wanted to follow up on was that idea of learning loss, because while this is very real, I do just want to take the opportunity to say this didn't necessarily occur everywhere, especially for those schools and districts that were already set up and ready to pivot to remote learning or a more flexible structure. So I think those are some bright spots too in the education world that came out of last year. But I think some other things I'd say is related to that infrastructure piece is just having the data in place so that you can take action on what you're seeing in your students, regardless if it's in person, online, or a hybrid mix of both. And that was new for so many that were maybe using new systems or platforms that they hadn't used before, setting up that data infrastructure so that you can escalate and support students through those tiers. So like one thing specifically that I'm alluding to is an early warning system. And you mentioned behaviors. In the online environment, so often what I hear from counselors that are transitioning is, I used to spend my time with behavior problems, discipline, office referrals, and that's where my time is going, is working with students through strategies, whatever they may be, anger management, etc. But online, what that really ends up translating to is an engagement issue, and most often disengagement. So it's really important for your early warning systems to have engagement in mind and be able to identify those students that are disengaged quickly and then take action to support those students. Because if you think about it, if you're teaching SEL in an online classroom, possibly the kids that need it most are the kids that aren't going to be there in that room. So that's really the problem you want to solve for if you find that in your school or in your district.
Yeah, that's the ones that have their hoodie up in bed with their screen down, and and that was actually the number one answer, right? When in our poll question at the beginning, was the importance of student engagement, and this is all untrodden territory. Right? This is not something, with the exception of virtual academies and schools, you would think that those students are probably already motivated to be in that sort of environment. The ones, I had a couple beta testers right here who just did not like the remote learning setup at all, and were disengaged to a high degree. So any lessons learned through that? Talk about maybe some innovations maybe that have been pulled out in terms of engaging students in this medium.
Well, let's take the example of the kid with the hoodie up in the back of the room. As a classroom teacher, it is simple to spot that and to, hopefully support that student pretty seamlessly, even while instructing a whole group of students. Online, if you think about Zoom, you've got a lot more mental space where you're cross-checking who's here, who isn't here, who's responding, who isn't responding. Did they respond last time? There's a lot more that you're kind of balancing in, let's just say, an online classroom that isn't quite as obvious as in person. So I think some of the things we've seen to be really effective is setting up your structure so that you have some support in place for someone to do the instruction and someone to do the checking on all those other kids, and that can also immediately take outreach, because that's the best thing we're going to do, and it's not rocket science, is to get to know our learners and build relationships with them. So that engagement and motivation poll question that came back, yeah, that's the nut to crack. If we can find out what drives our students, what ignites learning for them, what's going to make them show up to class, what gets them excited, do they know me as a teacher, and do I know them and what's going on at home and maybe what they've been facing that morning, that's going to motivate students to show up and also engage in the material. So again, a best practice in both brick and mortar and online, but can't be understated enough that those simple connections, which often this time of school year, back to school, it gets really busy, and it can be easy to accidentally brush that relationship building under the rug while you're getting all your preps done and your lessons and et cetera, and your back to school training and PD. But it's so important to take the time at the beginning of the year right now to get to know those learners and establish those expectations up front.
Yeah, let me just pause for a second and again encourage our audience to pepper Erica with questions. Already so many great insights being divulged here, but I think, while we have her, please enter in a few. We have another half hour to go. So let's talk a little bit about what I think, again, before pandemic, and we were talking about SEL as a luxury. And part of the reason it was perceived that way is because of maybe the cost, right? So, I mean, districts are thinking about cost, and if it's a nice to have, then that may be the first thing to go off of the budget sheet. But I know that according to research by the Teachers College at Columbia University, the benefits actually exceed the cost significantly. The numbers I have here results in a return of $11 on every dollar spent on programming. What long-term benefits and returns have you witnessed firsthand when it comes to the return?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because you're right that so many budget line items, easily get checked off. And then you see SEL and you say, oh, well, can we do without that? But the ROI is real. And like I said, these are life skills, life lessons that students are going to bring with them into the world of work or into their post-secondary education far beyond their education in the traditional K-12 world. So the things I've seen firsthand and are incredibly powerful are simply like preventing dropouts by students connecting with their teachers and feeling that belief in them and having some student agency and advocacy skills over themselves to help chart their path forward. That's probably the one I've seen most often. But there's also an opportunity, I believe, to improve. We've talked a lot about the pandemic, but a lot happened in 2020. And I think one of the other positives was really culturally relevant curriculum that, again, that keyword relevant is relevant for our students and what they want to do after high school. So really giving them course options that prepare them for what their goals are, and having that subject matter reflect who they look like and what our history is, as a nation, but also just as people. And so I think promoting career exploration within the SEL space is something that can really contribute to that ROI that you mentioned. The one other thing I've seen firsthand that I haven't quantified, but I've definitely witnessed it, is kind of a day-to-day cost savings. I sometimes refer to it as the churn. I mentioned earlier there's um, some disengagement, and that can really cause educators to spin their wheels just trying to connect with students or maybe track them down or connect with them. And so when we promote SEL up front and we get to know our students up front, I think we save a lot of that churn that maybe catches up with us around November, December timeframe, when we realize there's a student we really haven't connected with yet, and we're losing them.
Yeah. Well, we have some questions rolling in, which is great. And the first one is my fault. I should explain what ROI means, and that's return on investment. So that's an old business acronym that might not find its way in education too much. So yeah, it's about getting a return on the monies that you put into the program and the curriculum. Also, another question came in from another Erica. Can you give good resources or strategies on embedding SEL into content areas, especially at the secondary level?
Yeah. So there are 3 signature practices that don't relate specifically to SEL content, like teaching to those core competencies, but are best practices for any classroom to make students feel a sense of belonging and connectedness, which is really what we're driving for to get that engagement and motivation. And those are, you can Google the 3 signature practices of SEL, but what they are welcoming inclusion within a classroom, transitions or brain breaks. And then the third one is an optimistic closure. And so, what I encourage all of you to do as leaders in your school is these are great practices, even with meetings with adults. And I intentionally use them, and they really foster a sense of belonging and engagement from the get-go. If you imagine you're in Zoom with 50 educators and they've got their computer in front of them and they're multitasking and wanting to check emails, these really engage folks in that meeting, and the same goes for the classroom. And so one example of a welcoming inclusion is showing something I did just last week. Is you show an image. I had a picture of a rainbow kind of in a stormy sky. And I asked the educators I was with, how does this relate to back to school season for you? And that was the topic of our meeting that day. And the responses that came in, varied broadly. I could kind of see who needed a follow-up and who was thinking about things in different ways. And it really opened the door for a great conversation and meeting. The transitions and the brain breaks are meant to allow folks, students or adults, to process and kind of transition to another topic throughout during a classroom session. And these are really important. If you think about online, I think one thing we heard a lot was Zoom fatigue and meeting fatigue and kind of the eyes glazing over staring at the screen. So it can even be something not on the screen, even if you are in a virtual classroom where they're taking out a piece of paper and doing a reflection activity, writing with a pencil or a pen, or finding something around their house to bring back to the classroom, whatever it is. And finally, the optimistic closure is simply a way to reflect or ask a question or share a wondering for next time, the next time you're coming back together as a class or as a group. And so those are 3 very simple strategies, Erica, that I hope help. And you can use them again with adults and students. It's a great way to model SEL best practices for teachers.
Great. I think we broke the ice here ourselves. So more questions coming in. Any ideas for relationship building for elementary students that go beyond the typical icebreakers and getting to know you surveys?
Yeah, speaking with them one-on-one. So not rocket science, but connecting individually, especially with K-5 students, involving that parent, getting to know from their perspective what their students' strengths and challenges are. I think they're a crucial partner, especially at that young age when they're still heavily involved with that student's growth and development. Surveys, needs assessment, icebreakers, connecting with peers too. Forming friendships might be something somewhat new or that some students struggle with social skills. So finding ways for them to engage with a buddy, I think are a great idea as well.
Great. Let's pull it back a little bit. Something that came in your previous answers. how, in the big picture, how does SEL tie in to a point where maybe a student may need heavier mental health services? Is there, does it get tied into another program or another division, or because then we're actually talking about medical services as well? Is there any overlap there? Talk a little bit about, if there is, how that occurs.
Yeah, well, just from my background alone in counseling, there are three domains of counseling, and one of them is social emotional. And so, what your school counselors are focusing on in your school are the academic needs, the career needs, and the social emotional needs of all students. And so, when those needs kind of escalate beyond what, let's say, a classroom teacher can maybe handle in the setting they're in, or is even comfortable or trained to do, typically you're going to have some sort of escalation process where someone that can come in and intervene with that student and work with them on probably like a 6 to 8 week time frame in partnership with the teacher to teach strategies specific to what they may be struggling with. And work on implementing those. Now, if it goes beyond that time period, that's definitely a point where you would want to involve someone in your community for mental health counseling or something deeper that probably you can't support within the school resources alone.
Another kind of before the pandemic trend that I would always kind of pick up on when reporting on things such as this is faculty resistance. Ed tech in general, there was always this idea of the thwatties, that's the way I've always done it, and this is the way I'm always going to do it when it comes to teaching algebra or chemistry or whatever. 2020, that gets all turned on its head. Now everyone has to change whether they like it or not. Talk about the changing dynamics of introducing these concepts to teachers.
So the interesting thing about that, the research that Castle has done has shown that teachers overwhelmingly see the value and the need for SEL within all classrooms. What they struggle with is how exactly to do that. And that's where some of that training and that organization at your school level comes in of, the language and the strategies that teachers can use and teach in their classroom and across the school. What I find just in firsthand experience, and I don't think anyone here with us today who joined this session on this topic in particular is one of these folks, but is important to recognize is there are, folks that are quite resistant to SEL, either seeing it as fluff or extra or the fuzzy feeling kind of thing. And that's just not like, it's just not for me, or it's not me or what I'm comfortable with. And that's okay. But recognizing that in yourself or in the people that you work with is going to be important, just to help those people see the value and the benefits, because all that is out there, and then see how they can apply it in a way that they feel comfortable. But I think it's still really important because I see that a lot, even today. Just I hear that in day to day, and it's kind of like similar to someone who says, an English teacher, let's say, who says, I'm not a math person. If a math problem comes up, they kind of immediately cringe up and they're just not even going to touch it. There's some of that with SEL too, but I think the benefits far outweigh that. And what I would encourage you to do at your school is to establish a committee of champions, but even include those naysayers if you can. You should really have representation from each kind of department or group at your school, so that you do accomplish that school-wide implementation. And you're going to have champions who absolutely eat up SEL. They live it, they breathe it. You can just sense it in their bones. And those are great people to have as leaders in your school. And also include those folks that you can tell don't find a lot of value in it, and work with them to help them see the value and help be a part of the overall initiative.
Great. Another fuzzy term from over the years that became a stark reality is the idea of digital equity and digital access and equity for students. Talk a little bit about how you have underserved communities, you have a different variety of districts who are, again, probably struggling with money, as well as having struggles culturally to kind of work these sort of concepts in. How have talk about that? Talk about the equity angle to all of this. I mean, is this something that can be applied to every district?
I believe so. And I think it's important as part of our equity outreach to every single student to see who they are and where they're coming from, and how we can meet those needs, as a school. And so I just see it as hugely imperative. And for me personally, I'm really proud to be a part of an organization like Stride that was founded on equity and wanting to serve every single student with a high quality education, regardless of, where they live or where they're coming from. And when I was working for Chicago public schools, one thing that really stuck with me was I was meeting with a parent in our lobby, and she shared that it wasn't school safety that was an issue for her and her family. It was the actual commute between home and school that was so prevalent with violence that they had to make a change just for their own safety and well-being. And so that really stuck with me, that we can create, and we did, in the midst of this pandemic last year, create a safe learning environment for students that spanned beyond the school building walls. And so I think that's something we can really feel proud of, that the community ties we had, went beyond the building, and we proved that we could do that. So again, I just believe in that fuzzy term, Kevin, and it's something I've kind of dedicated my career to at this point. And I believe SEL is a core tenet in accomplishing that.
Yeah, some of the conversations I've had with districts, and particularly underserved communities, they found that the remote application of SEL turned into an advantage for them. So where you had, maybe you had a program in a school and there was one counselor for 1,000 students, to have these conversations and to give out the surveys and have these interactions, they were able to reach more students with less people, right? I mean, is that experience that you saw as well?
Yeah, a lot of times I heard from schools that were just getting started in the pandemic, was they were no longer able to provide these services kind of on their own as a single counselor in a building. And so they were charged with arming their teachers and their faculty with the same strategies and information to bring into their classroom. So it really turned into this kind of team of one to this whole school approach. And I see that definitely as a silver lining and really powerful.
Yeah. Now let's talk about steps. So again, a good portion of the audience today doesn't currently have an SEL program in place. What are your recommendations for taking those first steps?
Well, I think it depends on where you are a little bit and how things are in flux. I've been just watching the news, and I see different districts in different places. But what I would say first is, last year really thrust us into the unknown, and we don't have that as an excuse anymore. We really have to be prepared in case things change, and change quickly. So set up kind of that infrastructure now so that you're ready if you do find yourselves in the midst of a transition like we had before. And by that, I mean, think through equitable access and what equipment and, physical things like that are needed just to run and operate in a different environment, maybe. The other thing I'd say, especially at this time of year, is establishing those really clear expectations for behavior and engagement at the beginning of the year. And those might adjust slightly if you find you're online versus in a building, but really at the core, they're going to remain the same. And so having those clearly communicated for all of your students and parents at the beginning of the year is going to be really key. And infusing SEL into that is obvious as just part of your school-wide implementation. And then the other thing that you've heard me say before, but I'll come back to, is just that data piece, having some systemic ways to track the goals that you're after as a school and the behaviors that are mitigating those goals. So think about how you can measure engagement in your environment and if it changes. One other thing that came to mind is training. So if you're just getting ready to start SEL, I really encourage you to front load and think about your staff and your faculty. Don't just jump into delivering material to students and to parents. You really need to get your staff trained and educated. And the beautiful thing about SEL is it's not that you're just training on a platform or a curriculum or something. This is applicable to them in their lives. So I find educators who find that their own lives have been changed just because of this new like SEL initiative that their school had for their students. So that's a really beautiful outcome you may find, and that I would encourage you to work into your planning, is how you're going to onboard all of your groups.
That's a really important point. Also, something that you mentioned that we haven't touched upon yet, and I want to try to in our remaining minutes here, when you talked about data, and we also talked about teacher resistance in the past, and one that I always kind of picked up on was a teacher resistance to using data, in terms of, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an accountant, I'm almost kind of I'm an artist with my students, and how this sort of feedback won't be necessarily productive. Also, sometimes you would see in a lot of assessment programs, not only in SEL but just in traditional academic assessment, where those features and functions might just stay on the shelf and not be put in use, even while other parts of the tools are being used. Give some examples of how the data improves the work that an educator can do when it comes to social emotional learning.
Well, in my opinion and in my work, data drives everything. We don't really start anything without having something to go off of, and monitoring that throughout and looking for the results we know are in the best interest of students. So I think for those resistant educators, the key is making it easy for them, and that might be using your resources creatively, or helping them in some way, because we really can't deny or live in ignore the data anymore. What I've learned in online education is we don't only live in a data-driven world, we live in a big data world, and we have thousands of data points per student just because of everything they're engaging in and the systems we use. So why would we not harness that information to help us do better and support them the best? But going back to just like a singular, let's say, classroom teacher level, I think having ongoing and frequent needs-based assessments, diagnostics, and also formatives to help check for understanding. I don't think any teacher is going to resist that isn't important, knowing that students are learning what our goal is to teach them,
Sure.
and then allow us to meet them where they are and differentiate that instruction.
Great, thank you. Another question from the audience. In my urban district, we are seeing many negative effects of the pandemic on our scholars, especially in terms of trauma they've experienced, being away from the safe structure of school and the subsequent behavioral issues that we are seeing now that they are in school. What are some suggestions for helping kids acclimate back to the school environment in this difficult post-remote learning place where we are? Great question, thank you.
Great question. And this question itself is why I think SEL has become so mainstream over the past year or so, is we really found a need to kind of go back to our core and the best practices we know that work with kids and adults. But what I would say as a simple suggestion for you is work on establishing some communication and classroom and school day rituals that will help foster that positive association with students have with school and with their teacher and their peers, and help them feel more comfortable transitioning back to that school schedule and school day. I think those rituals are really important too. If you find yourself later in the school year in a transition, you can continue those. You might have to adjust them slightly, but students are going to recognize that and say, okay, this isn't normal, but this feels normal because every day we come into class and do, the do now or whatever the example is. And I myself have memories going back to elementary school of what some of those classroom rituals looked like. And so there's power in those and can really help students feel more comfortable.
Any distinctions between K-5, middle school, and high school that you can talk about in terms of if someone is considering this? Are those different sort of implementations? Talk a little bit. I'm assuming there may be some behavioral differences.
Yeah, you're definitely going to see things manifest differently just based on child development. But in terms of like an SEL curriculum or a program, the one thing I find really empowering is you can use the same language with a kindergartner as you do for a 12th grader, and it's going to be meaningful and powerful for both of them. So I think that kind of simplifies SEL implementation, is you can do it district wide or across a K through 12 grade level. And that even promotes some of that consistency for students throughout their schooling or within their family if they have siblings and that type of thing. So I would say we can use the same kind of growth mindset language to come back to that one example. But the way we explain it and teach it might be different. The activities we do are certainly going to be developmentally appropriate, but that common language can exist across all grades.
Great. And I knew that the most difficult part of our conversation would be to end it. There's so many different aspects, especially in this time. But let me finish up by asking, where it's kind of a horizon question. So, and again, from the point of view of someone who's in the audience here who hasn't started on the journey or maybe isn't some part of it, what should they be looking for in the next few years? Let's make the glass half full. The pandemic has subsided. We go back to whatever normal is going to look like. What are your best case scenarios going forward when it comes to the new culture of SEL in schools?
Great question. Kind of tough to answer, but I think what I'd say, if you could tell, I'm a silver lining person, if you haven't been able to tell from this conversation. And I think one thing I think we should all look for is that we're going to continue to ride this wave of the importance of SEL and what it does for our students and what it does for their academic achievement. And that we are going to continue supporting those holistic approaches to grow the whole child in our schools. And that this is going to translate into hopefully all of our classroom teachers and content area teachers to see that the SEL core competencies allow for greater success in the classroom and beyond, so that we can work with others and take other perspectives and, put ourselves in someone else's shoes. And some of those, again, really essential skills that we need to be successful in school and in life are going to stick around, hopefully long after the pandemic is behind us.
Well, that's a great way to wrap things up with silver linings and glasses half full. So Erica, thank you so much for your time and your insights this afternoon. I think it's personally been a very invigorating and enlightening conversation. I think by the number of questions we got and the intensity of the questions that I think a lot of people really are coming away with a better understanding of what social emotional learning is and its importance and how to put it in. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
So if you submitted a question that we didn't get to in the Q&A portion, someone from Stride will follow up with you directly. Again, I'd like to thank our Erica today for a very informative presentation. And I'd like to thank all the audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating and have a great day.